Megafauna that ate humans, when our ancestors were prey, not predators. We tend to think of humans as the top of the food chain, creatures who tamed nature, mastered fire, and eventually hunted just about anything. But that wasn't always the case. For a large part of our evolutionary history, our ancestors, Australopithecines, early members of the genus Homo, and eventually Homo sapiens, were themselves potential food for far stronger, faster, and better armed predators. This isn't a metaphor or speculation. It's backed by fossils with bite marks, broken bones found in predator dens, and geological layers that directly show who ate whom. In this piece, we'll look at which megafauna posed a real threat to hominins over millions of years, what evidence survives, and how the gradual shift in the balance of power, from prey to hunter, became one of the key factors in human evolution. What megafauna means here, and why it matters. Megafauna is a general term for large animals, usually weighing more than about 40 to 45 kilograms, that dominated Pleistocene ecosystems, roughly 2.6 million to 11,700 years ago, and earlier periods. This includes giant herbivores, mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, as well as predators capable of hunting large prey, including primates and early humans. It's worth remembering, for most of hominin history, our ancestors had no firearms, no steel knives, not even reliable stone-tipped spears. Early Australopithecines and the first members of Homo had weak canine teeth, relatively modest physical strength compared to other primates, slow running speed, and lived in savannas and woodlands densely populated by predators specialized in hunting medium-sized primates. In that kind of environment, being eaten wasn't an exception. It was a statistically expected outcome for a meaningful share of the population. How scientists know someone was eaten. This is arguably the most fascinating part of the whole story, the methodology. Paleoanthropologists and taphonomists, specialists in what happens to remains after death, have learned to recognize the signs of predation on fossilized bones. Key markers include puncture and scrape marks from teeth. The shape, depth, and spacing between punctures can identify not just some predator, but a specific species, since the arrangement of canine teeth is nearly as unique as a fingerprint across different animals. Skull damage patterns. Some predators, leopards for instance, have a habit of biting through the skull of their prey at specific points to reach the brain, leaving two characteristic holes a certain distance apart. The location of the find. If hominin bones are found together with large numbers of other animal bones in a cave, this often indicates the cave wasn't a human dwelling, but a predator's den where prey was brought back to feed. Absence of burial or ritual markers. Scattered, damaged bones, often missing certain skeletal parts, are typical of remains left after a predator fed, rather than deliberate human burial. Thanks to these methods, scientists have been able to reconstruct entire episodes from the life and death of our distant relatives. The Tong child and the riddle of the bird of prey. One of the most famous cases is the so-called Tong child, a roughly 2.8 million-year-old fossil of Australopithecus africanus found in South Africa. For a long time, researchers struggled to explain the damage to this child's skull. One hypothesis that gained significant support suggested the child was killed by a large bird of prey, possibly similar to modern eagles or crowned eagles, capable of lifting prey weighing several kilograms. The pattern of damage to the eye sockets and skull was compared to how modern birds of prey handle primate prey, including documented observations of crowned eagles that still occasionally attack young monkeys, and, in rare cases, human children in some regions of Africa today. This hypothesis remains debated. Other researchers have proposed alternative explanations for the damage, including post-mortem geological processes. But the fact that such a hypothesis is taken seriously by the scientific community illustrates the broader picture well. Small, poorly defended hominins could easily become prey even for animals we wouldn't classify as megafauna in the classic sense, but which posed a serious threat in the context of their time. Swartkrans, the hyena den. Another classic example is the Swartkrans cave in South Africa, where a large number of early hominin bones, including members of the genus Paranthropus and early Homo, were found alongside numerous bones of antelope, zebra, and other animals. For a long time, the assumption was that hominins had brought the animal bones there after hunting. However, detailed taphonomic analysis revealed the opposite. The The pattern of fractures, tooth marks, and overall bone distribution matched the typical diet of large spotted hyenas and similar predators of that era, which used the cave as a feeding den. In other words, in this case, the hominins weren't the hunters who brought food home. They were the food. This discovery marked an important turning point in understanding early human evolution. Instead of the image of man the hunter, always in control, a far more complex and realistic picture emerged, one in which early hominins were constantly balancing between the role of hunter and the role of prey. Saber-toothed cats, Smilodon and Homotherium. When it comes to prehistoric predators capable of killing large animals, including primates and humans, saber-toothed cats are among the first that come to mind. Smilodon, the most famous member of this group, lived in the Americas and had canine teeth up to 28 centimeters long. While its primary prey consisted of large herbivores, bison, horses, young mammoths, this predator could well have posed a threat to the first humans who arrived on the American continent via Beringia toward the end of the Pleistocene. The period of coexistence between humans and Smilodon in North and South America lasted several thousand years before saber-toothed cats went extinct around 10,000 years ago. Homotherium, a lesser-known but no less formidable relative of Smilodon, had longer limbs adapted for sustained running and, according to some evidence, may have hunted in packs, similar to modern lions. This species lived in the Americas as well as across Eurasia and Africa, meaning its range likely overlapped with early hominins for much longer and across far more regions than Smilodons did. Cave lions and cave hyenas of Europe and Asia. In Pleistocene Europe and Asia, humans, first Neanderthals and later Homo sapiens, had to coexist with the cave lion, Panthera spilea, a close relative of the modern lion, but larger and better adapted to cold climates. Cave lions hunted large herbivores, deer, wild horses, young mammoths, but archaeological data from some sites suggest occasional conflicts between humans and these predators, likely over competition for carcasses of killed animals or for the caves themselves as shelter. Depictions of cave lions in European caves, notably the Chauvet cave in France, show just how significant these animals were to the minds of ancient people. They were painted more often and in more detail than many other species. Just as important was the cave hyena, Crocuta spilea, a subspecies of spotted hyena adapted to Europe's cold climate. Cave hyenas used caves as dens to which they brought prey, and in several such dens, Neanderthal bones with hyena tooth marks have been found, direct evidence that these animals, at least occasionally, fed on human remains, though it remains unclear whether this involved attacks on living people or scavenging of already dead bodies. The giant short-faced bear of the Americas. Arctodus simus, or the short-faced bear, was one of the largest terrestrial predatory mammals of the late Pleistocene in North America. By some estimates, adult individuals could weigh over 900 kilograms and, standing on their hind legs, exceed 3 meters in height. For a long time, there was debate about whether Arctodus was primarily a predator or a scavenger, similar to modern grizzly bears. More recent isotopic studies of its bones suggest Arctodus was predominantly a predator, capable of actively hunting large prey. For the first humans who arrived in the Americas at the end of the Pleistocene, an encounter with such a bear could have ended tragically, and while direct archaeological evidence of Arctodus attacks on humans is limited, the simple fact that these species coexisted in the same territory means the risk was real. Crocodilians, a danger that hasn't gone away. Giant crocodilians, though some of the largest species, such as much older Mesozoic-era giants, went extinct long before humans appeared, still include several species that coexisted directly with early hominins and posed a direct threat to them. Large Pleistocene crocodilians of Africa and Asia reached sizes sufficient to attack large primates and humans who came to bodies of water to drink or fish. This is, incidentally, one of the reasons many studies of human evolution emphasize the importance of water sources, not just as a resource for food, but as zones of heightened risk. Interestingly, this threat isn't purely prehistoric. Modern Nile crocodiles and saltwater crocodiles are responsible for hundreds of human deaths each year in Africa and Southeast Asia, making them among the few classic megafauna representatives that continue to actively hunt humans today. Megalania and other Australian megafauna. Australia deserves special attention, since its wildlife evolved in isolation and produced highly distinctive predators. Megalania, Varanus priscus, a giant monitor lizard, was the largest known terrestrial lizard in history, with some estimates suggesting it reached over 5 meters in length. While the exact timing of its extinction is still debated, there is a hypothesis of partial overlap between Megalania and the first humans who arrived in Australia tens of thousands of years ago. If true, an encounter with an animal capable of both mechanical and potentially toxic bites, by analogy with modern Komodo dragons, Megalania's closest living relatives, could have been fatal. Beyond Megalania, Australia was also home to other formidable predators of that period. Large marsupial carnivores, such as Thylacoleo carnifex, the so-called marsupial lion, which had a uniquely shaped set of teeth among mammals, optimized for slicing rather than puncturing, and, according to paleontologists' estimates, was capable of successfully hunting prey much larger than itself. South America's terror birds, did they overlap with humans? Phorusrhacidae, known as terror birds, were a group of giant flightless predatory birds from South America, some species of which stood over 2.5 meters tall. The most famous genus, Titanus, even reached into North America. The problem with this group is a timing gap. Most terror birds went extinct before the mass human settlement of the Americas, somewhere between 100,000 and 1.8 million years ago, depending on the specific species. This means direct, widespread coexistence between humans and terror birds most likely didn't happen, though science can't completely rule out limited short-term range overlap for later dates in isolated relic populations. Why the balance of power eventually shifted. If in earlier stages of evolution, hominins were genuinely often prey, the situation gradually changed, and there are several key reasons for this. First, mastery of fire. Control over fire, which by various estimates began at least 400,000 to 1 million years ago, possibly earlier, dramatically changed the dynamics between humans and predators. Fire deterred most animals, allowed people to light up spaces at night when large predator activity peaks, and enabled cooking food, which also had an indirect but important influence on brain development and social structure. Second, the development of cooperation and group behavior. Unlike most solitary predators, humans could organize into large, coordinated groups. Group hunting, group defense, division of roles, all of this sharply reduced the risk of becoming a victim of attack, since even the fiercest predator would think twice before attacking a group of dozens of people armed with sticks and stones, whereas a lone individual would have been easy prey. Third, technological progress in weapon making. Stone-tipped spears, throwing weapons, and eventually the bow and arrow, allowed humans not just to defend themselves, but to become effective hunters of the very animals that had once hunted them. This shift, from prey to competitor, and eventually to predator, is considered one of the most important turning points in the entire history of the relationship between humans and megafauna. Fourth, it's worth noting the role of climate and the late Pleistocene megafaunal extinction. The mass disappearance of large mammals roughly 11,700 to 50,000 years ago, the relative roles of climate and human impact remain a subject of ongoing scientific debate, led to the disappearance of a significant portion of humanity's potential predators, simply due to insufficient prey base and changing ecosystems. The psychological and cultural legacy of fear of predators. An interesting side effect of the long period during which humans were potential prey is just how deeply the fear of large predators became embedded in human psychology and culture. Evolutionary psychologists have repeatedly proposed the hypothesis that the specific, almost instinctive human fear of snakes, big cats, and darkness may be partly explained by that long period when encounters with such threats regularly ended in death. This hypothesis is consistent with humanity's cultural legacy as well. Images of large predators, lions, tigers, dragons, which in some cultures are considered a stylized combination of traits from real large predators and reptiles, occupy a central place in the mythology of nearly every ancient civilization. Cave paintings, the oldest known works of visual art, frequently depict large predators rather than peaceful herbivores, which may also reflect how significant and emotionally charged this aspect of ancient human life was. Conclusion. The history of the relationship between humans and megafauna isn't a one-sided story of triumphant conquest over nature, but a long and complicated process in which our ancestors, for millions of years, were not only hunters, but also regular prey for leopards, hyenas, saber-toothed cats, giant bears, crocodilians, and possibly even giant birds of prey and lizards. Fossils bearing tooth marks, remains found in predator dens, and geological data allow scientists to reconstruct this hidden side of human evolution, a side that often remains overshadowed by the more familiar narrative of humans as dominant hunters. Understanding this period matters not just for science, but for better grasping where some of our deepest human fears come from, why cooperation and social structure became so central to our species, and how prolonged predation pressure may have shaped the very traits that eventually helped humanity become the dominant species on the planet, including intelligence, ingenuity, and the ability to work together for mutual survival.